Good evening and welcome to this exclusive subscriber event, the Telegraph Book Club with Rory Stewart. I'm George Chesterton, Senior Features Writer at the Telegraph, and I'll be asking Rory about his book, Politics on the Edge, and what it reveals about him and the past tumultuous decade and a half in British politics. First, some housekeeping. You may make the video full screen by clicking on the square at the bottom right. For this event, questions have been submitted to me in advance, but please do email extra@telegraph.co.uk if you have any difficulties, as colleagues are on hand to help you. So, Rory, academic, diplomat, travel writer, NGO administrator, former MP for Penrith and the Border, deep breath, Environment Minister, Foreign Office Minister, Prisons Minister, Secretary of State for International Development, candidate for leadership of the Conservative Party, and now a hugely successful podcaster. What is extraordinary about this book at the beginning is that when you list all the things that the book is not going to include. So could you just give us a brief summary about what sort of led you into writing the book, what you felt you wanted to discuss, and why there were certain things that you wanted to leave out?
Yeah, I mean, the book is really about bringing people inside the experience of being an MP. And often if you read political memoirs, as I'm sure you have, they tend to focus on the kind of big public decisions and achievements. They're often ways for politicians to talk up what they did and run for re-election. I'm trying instead to bring alive the kind of more everyday, quieter moments. So, give you one example. I described the fact that I was trying to get broadband into my constituency in Cumbria. Very, very excited. I'd rebelled against the government, so I wasn't being promoted, and I had spent 2.5 years organising broadband. And finally, I get the Secretary of State responsible for broadband to come up to my constituency, and I go to see the whips, pairing whip, and I say, can I be excused from the vote so I can get the last train up to Penrith? And the pairing whip said no. And I said, well, why not? You know, it's like the majority of 52. Why can't I go up to my constituency? And the answer is he's basically just saying no because it's like a really rubbish school in which he's an older boy and he's just going to bully me by saying no. So finally he says, can you not take the night bus? And sure enough, there's a night bus which changes at Preston at 2 a.m. and you can just about get to Penrith. So I'm in Penrith and all the broadband activists are all lined up and they're all waiting, 150 people from different villages. And Secretary of State comes in his amazing car and I charge forward to meet him. And he basically looks at his watch and says to his private secretary, we don't have time for this. You've got to get on. I'm not doing this. And turns around and gets straight back in the car again, drives off, leaving me with my 150 broadband activists. And a lot of the book is about those sort of events. It's about trying to get under the rhetoric of government, behind this idea that somebody is a minister or a member of parliament, towards the reality, which is often very, very strange, shabby, non-functioning budget.
With that example in mind, you often refer to your experiences in Afghanistan in terms of the achievements that you were able to enact there and the differences you could make in that context, in that environment. Paradoxically, is it not, in a sense, is it not a problem for you in that you feel like you were in an environment where you did achieve so much, and then when you apply that mindset to being an MP or even a minister, when you have some semblance of power, that frustration is even greater for you because you felt that you're always comparing and contrasting between that experience.
I think that's right, and I think it'll be interesting. Labour's brought in ministers who've had big jobs in the private sector. They just brought in as their prisons minister James Timpson, who ran this wonderful company that does shoe repairs and keys. And again, you realise that if people come into a ministerial job having done something significant in business, it's very difficult to adjust. Because at most, a minister sort of has influence. And it's worse than that. It's the minister has influence, but they pretend to have power. So we're always telling the public, telling journalists, giving the impression that, the buck stops with us, we're responsible. Certainly when things go well, we take all the credit for it. Maybe when things go badly, we're like, no, we don't know. But the truth of the matter is that getting things done in government is a total strange art form. It's like one of those kind of medieval Japanese theatre forms. It's kind of strange, kind of kabuki opera where you gradually develop these weird roundabout knacks to get things done, but it's never as straightforward as saying, you know, I want you to do this, and civil servants delivering it in 2 months' time.
A lot of the time, the qualities you stress that you think are important in the book are things like honesty, openness, independent thinking. You know, is it possible that those qualities make it, if they're the things that you believe are important, and possibly they believe would work in government? Is it possible, looking back now, that in a way that made it almost impossible for you to have high office because you put so much emphasis on qualities which are absent from government?
Well, I think you can do it, but it's quite difficult to do it. I mean, so that there's a friend of mine called David Gork who managed to be very successful, have 3 major cabinet positions, and he's a man of a lot of integrity, very straightforward, gets things done. But he's quite a almost sort of saintly figure. Generally, those were not the people. I mean, I had 3 bosses as a junior minister, and they were Liz Truss, Priti Patel, and Boris Johnson. And these are people who made it to the very, very top. You know, 2 of them became Prime Minister, 1 of them became Home Secretary. And they were not really very interested in their briefs, in their departments. You know, they didn't, you know, Liz Truss didn't really give the impression she was she was the Minister for Farming and the Environment. She didn't give the impression she was very interested in nature or in farmers or in visiting national parks. In fact, she said to me, I remember this quite clearly, she said, I think foreign affairs is a complete waste of time. We should abolish the Foreign Office. And then she becomes Foreign Secretary. So how do they make it to the top? They don't make it to the top because of their performance in those departments. Nobody actually, and this is partly our media landscape and our politics, nobody sits down and says, how well did Priti Patel do her job as Development Secretary before they promoted her to be Home Secretary? How good was Liz Truss at delivering on farming and the environment before they make her Foreign Secretary? Or how good was Boris Johnson at running the Foreign Office? Nobody seems to care about that. Mm. Instead, they make it to the top through something else, and they make it to the top by sort of sparkling in some strange way in the media. And sometimes with the case of Liz Truss, it's that they make good friends with journalists, and they leak and they brief and they get written up nicely in exchange for leaking information what happens in the cabinet. But it's a very odd system. It's not like the way in which hopefully a normal job works, which is somebody tries to look at your performance and then...
I mean, you paint, just to carry on that subject, you paint a very vivid picture of 5 successive prime ministers at various points of their career in this period. I mean, to be frank, sometimes the way you portray them is borderline sociopathic, I think it seems to be. Just could you elaborate a bit more on what the kind of qualities you feel that those, well, perhaps those people exhibited in order to kind of get to the top of politics, and also what perhaps would have been better if other qualities that they'd had that would have made them more successful prime ministers, do you think?
Well, the exception to this story, I think, is Theresa May,
yes,
who I think was a genuinely serious, dignified, thoughtful person who took public service seriously. I mean, people can disagree about her, but she was genuinely somebody who, at a personal level, I could admire. And we've had a lovely example of this during the election. Stepping down, former prime minister, nothing to gain, and yet throughout the election she was out pounding the streets, delivering leaflets, knocking on doors, trying to get moderate MPs re-elected out of a sense of duty. And I don't think any of the others would have done that for a second. Right? Mm. So what allowed the others to make it to the top? It's an ability to sort of hit a particular mood, often in the media. Mm. And it's about, in the case of Liz Truss, it's about projecting, I'm radical, I'm for cutting taxes, I'm going to make growth, I'm not afraid to rock the boat. In the case of Boris Johnson, it's I'm a sort of no-nonsense kind of bluff kind of character who's going to get Brexit done and make Britain great again and sort of stuff. But it's sort of pantomime. I mean, these people are not serious about doing their jobs. They don't read their briefs seriously. I mean, when you sit around the table with them, and as a junior minister, Boris was my direct boss, Liz Truss was my direct boss, so I would sit with them, hour after hour, trying to watch them manage things. And, Boris's idea of management was to essentially have a little white card, and it seemed to be the white card almost the same every week. He was Foreign Secretary. And you go, cripes, right, so North Korea seems to be a problem. We should do something about North Korea. And then Iran, been a problem in Iran. You're just sort of listening to stuff as though he's sort of got a copy of The Economist from about 15 years ago next to his loo that he sort of looked at coming to the meeting. And when he said to me, he said, Rory, Libya is a... Oh, well, here's a classic example. Try to give you an example. My first day in the Foreign Office, I've been appointed as the Minister of State, and so I have to ask Boris, who's the Foreign Secretary, which part of the world he's going to assign me to. So he says, Rory, where do you want to go? So I say, well, I don't mind, but I think it'd have to be the Middle East or Asia, because I've spent nearly 15 years working that. I speak 3 Asian languages, and I've been the Middle East Asia Minister in DFID, so I know the programs, I've met all the heads of state, I'm really into those countries, I know all the details. And he goes, how about Africa? And I say, well, listen, I don't know anything about Africa. Literally, I haven't been there once on a holiday. I know nothing about Africa. So he says, come on, what's the capital of Uganda? So I say, I don't know. He says, come on, Rory, you're lying. It's Kampala. You're the Africa minister. Right? And sure enough, he makes me the Africa minister. Now, what's going on? What's he doing? Right? He's got somebody who has just told him that he's spent many, many years studying the Middle East and Asia, can hit the ground running, understands all the programs, achieve his objectives. And he deliberately puts me somewhere I know nothing about.
What's your sense of why he did that?
I think it's probably a combination of a lot of things. I think one of them is that he probably doesn't want somebody who thinks they know too much about stuff. And he's probably got some other complicated things to do with what he's really interested in, which is becoming Prime Minister, which is how can he put someone else in those jobs who are more likely to back him for the leadership?
I mean, in a sense, when you talk about Liz Truss and Boris Johnson in particular, there is that sense that everything is leading to that final point in everything they do. There's a kind of continuum of ambition that runs through every action they take and everything they say.
Yeah.
Would you say that's the case?
That's right. And I mean, without, maybe it's a silly analogy, but it would be like somebody, I don't know, going on a 1,000-mile journey and spending their entire time just thinking about the end and not taking in anything that surrounds them. So they're in these incredible jobs where they could be making so much difference to people's lives, right? You're responsible, Liz Truss responsible for all of the British landscape, air quality, water quality, all the forests in England, everything, right? Boris Johnson's responsible as Foreign Secretary for Britain and the entire world. They should be stopping, taking a deep breath and saying, what a privilege, what an incredible job. I'm going to really get into this job and try to understand it and make my department much better when I leave than I found it. But because their minds are so fixed on becoming Prime Minister, actually what they're spending their time doing is organising their little leadership cabals, posting their Instagram, spending their time with journalists, because what matters to becoming Prime Minister is media coverage, MPs, and the party and the country. It's not. And that's why Boris Johnson actually didn't travel very much. And it's Liz Truss, again, as Foreign Secretary, their sense is if they're going to become Prime Minister and they're Foreign Secretary, their voters are in Britain. So why would they focus on that?
You talk a lot, some of the most interesting aspects of the book I felt were when you explain the relationship between backbenchers and the whips. You gave lots of examples of, well, you gave one just now, but there are other examples of those kind of pushing and pulling and pressure. And if the system depends on high levels of conformity and obedience,
Yeah.
and in a sense you could say it's blind loyalty, which is the only way of rewarding people.
Yeah.
Is that inevitable in any political system, or how do you feel about how you might go about addressing a system which deters independent thought, as it were?
Well, I think it's not good because, you know, when it comes to something like COVID, or even debates around things like Brexit, you need a bit of independent thought. You need disagreement around the cabinet table. You need a bit of critical thinking. And if you're only promoting people who are blindly loyal, creating something that feels like the kind of Bulgarian Communist Party in the 1970s, where all standing up to applaud the leader and kind of following the party line, you're not going to end up with very good government. And look, there are organizations that are very conformist and very obedient. Militaries are like that. But they compensate for that with incredible training, which we don't have as politicians. You know, officer goes to Sandhurst, goes to Staff College, and they also have a very, very strong sense of their values as officers, what they do, what they won't do, their ethics, their responsibility, which they can use to kind of balance against the loyalty bit. If you create a conformist thing with no sense of values, you end up going down a very, very odd route.
Are there any sort of, do you feel there are any obvious ways that we could go about improving or sort of building improvement of MPs into the system? In other words, ways that we could foster a higher calibre of MP as it you know, coming into the system, rather than squashing them as soon as they kind of arrive?
Yeah, I think there's a lot you could do. I mean, I think the first thing is to start by, culturally, some of it's just about leadership and culture, saying to everybody, whips, senior MPs, being an MP is a serious job, and we're going to treat these people as adults, and we're going to take them seriously. I'm going to treat them as children and whip them through votes they don't understand and don't believe in and try to trick them and humiliate them. Right? Coming in with me were full colonels from the army, 3 GPs, people who, you know, were worth hundreds of millions of pounds, who'd run major businesses, who'd run major councils around the country. People were coming in with me who were in their 60s, and they were being treated as though they were kind of 13-year-olds. And over time, if you treat people like children, they become children. You infantilize them. Right? If you say to them, there's no point reading the legislation because you're going to vote, they stop reading the legislation. If you say there's no point, you know, writing a speech because nobody's listening to it, then anyway, you've got to vote with the government, then people stop putting energy into speeches. If you're told that every time you do an interview, your only job is to repeat the long-term economic plan is working, the long-term economic plan is working, and not answer any question ever, you are essentially switching off people's brains at the kind of brain stem. So you change the culture, but there are other things you could do. You know, Keir Starmer could have said and should have said, everybody taking over is going to go through a 3-week training course in this department. Everybody's going to be a minister for a minimum of 2 years. And I'm guaranteed, unless there's a scandal, you'd stay in the job for a minimum 2 years. He didn't do those things, and he could have done.
When you say training, do you mean training on their particular briefs, or about their attitude and approach, or kind of more of a kind of sort of pastoral training? Is that what...
I think you'd probably want to do both. I mean, you know, if you take, I think you need both. You need the values bit. You need to teach people how to be a minister, how to be an MP, and part of that is your moral conduct. But also the content of the job. I mean, if I'm taking over as Africa Minister, and really you want to make me Africa Minister when I know nothing about Africa, then for goodness sake, you know, what is a Foreign Office Minister? Where is Cameroon? What are the land borders around it? What's the history? And boy, you better hope that these people are very, very bright and paying a lot of attention, because even 3 weeks is not a great deal to learn about a whole different continent.
When you were working for the Department of International Development, could you just talk us through the challenges you felt in terms of the way that the budget was held, and yet you also noted in the book that we were underspending on other things? I mean, it must have been quite a pull for you, because obviously you care about international development, and you were kind of a very apposite person for that role, and yet you're also aware of austerity as well. Could you just explain that a bit more, how that kind of played on your mind when you were...
Well, it is very difficult. So I became a minister in the Department of International Development, and eventually the Secretary of State. And at that point, we spent 0.7% of our GDP on international aid, and it was enshrined in law. So we were spending £13.5 billion in international aid, and there was no constraint, because it had to be spent on international aid. So I was literally sitting there thinking, do I put £150 million into an education program in Ethiopia or £60 million into a health program in Nigeria? It's this kind of scale of decisions you're making, almost daily. You know, do I give £2,500 million to the World Bank for a replenishment? I mean, these are really huge numbers. And then I end up in my next job as the prisons minister and discover that having in the morning made decisions on thousands of millions of pounds, in the afternoon I'm trying to decide whether or not we're going to rent out 3 floors of our building to make £7 million a year.
You were dealing with budgets of the budget you got for the extra, the 10 prisons project was 10 million, wasn't
Exactly.
it? So
which is a complete rounding error in DFID. I mean, I think it was a mistake during austerity to create these protected budgets. And effectively, we doubled the international development spend while we were reducing all the other budgets. I believe passionately in international development, but if you are to keep the public's support for it and to make it part of our public life, you have to be more prudent and more thoughtful about it. And one of those things is that, and I think it's good practice for all parts of government to feel the pain of cuts equally.
Just to go back to that period again, I mean, when we talked about prime ministers, you talked quite a lot about David Cameron, and you sort of highlight some of his kind of key characteristics as a kind of sort of insouciance and the kind of sense of, well, I'm a very powerful person. I don't really have to sort of compromise in any way with anybody. That was why do you think was he different to the other prime ministers in that sense? I suppose he was in power for longer, but he comes across in your book as someone who was quite unapproachable. Actually, I don't know if that's how you felt.
Well, I never knew him in the way that I knew the others. I mean, the others I knew much better as people. I found him quite distant and standoffish, at least in relation to me. And it wasn't helped by the fact that he'd gone around before I became a Member of Parliament telling people that he thought I shouldn't be a Member of Parliament and he was going to try to stop it. But I suppose it was partly also a sort of slight sense of disappointment because, broadly speaking, we come from a kind of similar background. We both believed in a sort of more centre conservative party. We agreed about international development and the environment. We both probably believed in kind of decency in politics. So I was just really disappointed. And I also felt there was a lack of seriousness there, that when I briefed him on Afghanistan, he was just kind of casual about the whole thing. He didn't really, and maybe it's a self-defense mechanism. Maybe he needed to convince himself that there was no point thinking too deeply about things and he could just get them done and move on. And that's how he got through his day. But I could have done with a little bit more sense that he really was worried about these things. I think if you're serious about the job, you have to worry a bit. And he gave too much the impression that everything was very easy. Yeah.
Do you think, in that sense, you were an anomaly in that when you were dealing with issues that you were very knowledgeable about, it kind of put you at a disadvantage because they, as you sort of alluded to that already, they didn't really want to know what you thought because if it was contradictory or awkward or it got in the way of something else they were trying to do. It's very unusual. I think it's probably quite unusual for a minister to have that level of knowledge about a specific area in the way that you did, relating to what you've done in the past. I mean, do you think that it worked against you in a sense in that way?
Yeah, I don't think our system is designed for ministers to know very much about their subject. When civil servants come in and brief you, they're the experts and you're the amateur. So I remember being briefed on Afghanistan by civil servants, and I spoke Dari, I lived in Afghanistan, I worked in Afghanistan, and the people briefing me never been to Afghanistan, or one of them had been to Afghanistan, but for a pretty short period, and certainly none of them spoke an Afghan language. And I'd written 2 books on Afghanistan, and they're telling me that I need to put 75 million to the Afghan police, and I'm saying, listen, I've studied this subject, we shouldn't do that. And I realized that they couldn't really process that. The deal was supposed to be they're the deep experts, not me. And that's one problem. I think another problem is that politics has a very complicated relationship to knowledge because, it's not a pompous way of putting it, but I had a colleague yesterday say to me, you've got this all wrong, Rory. We don't need to know anything as ministers. Just take the information from civil servants and then we make bold decisions. And I have to say, look, it doesn't make sense. You can't actually manage something if you know nothing. Because how can you assess the information they're giving you? Right? If they suddenly say to you, oh, we got this great new president in Zimbabwe called Emerson the Crocodile Mnangagwa, and we really got to get behind him, he's a terrific fellow. How do you know whether it's true enough? You don't know anything about Zimbabwe. I mean, how you spoke, and then what's the be bold and get on with stuff? And that's the Liz Truss problem. She's being bold and getting on with stuff, but she's refusing to listen to the Office of Budget Responsibility, the Treasury, economists. Why? Because at some level, she thinks the job of the politician isn't to know anything. It's to do things without knowing stuff. But you can't do stuff without knowing stuff. And I don't know why it's difficult to explain that. I'm not sort of suggesting that a politician is ever going to know more than a tiny fraction of what they could know about the world. But you need some inquisitiveness, some interest in evidence and facts, and some sense of humility, some sense of what you don't know, to be able to manage anything.
Just if we could have just a moment of light relief, I just wondered if you could explain why you think your hedgehog speech caused such a kind of got such attention. In fact, I remember reading that some people said you should be the leader on the basis of that speech.
That's right. That's right.
Would you like to kind of elucidate that a bit?
Yeah. So there was a debate in the House of Commons where somebody had proposed that the hedgehog should become the national symbol, Britain. Right? So I and I was the minister responsible for applying. So I made a 12-minute speech on hedgehogs, ancient Greeks and hedgehogs, hedgehog debates in Parliament, the hedgehog as a national symbol. And I finished by saying, I don't think it's a very good national symbol to have something that sleeps half the year and then calls up into a little ball whenever it's threatened, and tried to suggest maybe the lion was a kind of better way to go. Right? And as you say, I mean, the Deputy Speaker very sweetly said, it's the best speech they'd ever heard in Parliament, and it went viral on YouTube. And I suddenly realised that this piece of comedy and my jokes about hedgehogs were being seen sort of 2 million times on YouTube, when my speeches on Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria are completely ignored. And that says it's quite funny, but it's also not that funny.
So again, moving on to things that are quite funny but not funny, the leadership contest. You paint a very familiar picture of Boris Johnson in terms of, boundless optimism, deliberate lack of detailed knowledge of anything, lots of sort of bluff and bluster and that kind of stuff that people are very familiar with. Did the people that did not support his leadership bid, were people openly discussing what kind of leader he might be and what fears people had about him at the time? Before he was Prime Minister, were people saying, I am concerned about this person becoming Prime Minister?
Yeah. I mean, those of us that were trying to stop him being Prime Minister was saying, we've worked with him, he doesn't read his briefs, he doesn't concentrate on details, and he's not straight because he's always trying to please the last person he spoke to. And everybody knew that because everybody had been charmed and slightly lied to. And then he would apologize to you in a very charming way and kind of disarm you for whatever promise he'd broken. I mean, sometimes he doesn't quite lie. Sometimes it's a sort of glancing things. So I remember during the leadership, his first round for leadership, he's trying to convince me to back him. He said, Rory, I don't believe a word I'm about to say to you, but I can imagine you, flying around the world as my foreign secretary, scattering a bit of eau de cologne on the English eau de cologne on the. So the clever thing there is that he sort of both promised me I can be foreign secretary and said, don't believe a word I'm about to say to you. So so sometimes he's like that. But when I said to colleagues, we literally cannot have this person as we cannot have this person as prime minister, right? It's not, this is a serious country. It's not a serious person. He cannot do this. And what I try to say is we're going to see that. We're going to see that when a crisis happens. And that's what I felt, with COVID, right? There's a fundamental lack of seriousness here. And the response was, that's true, Rory, from his supporters, but he can win elections. And I still don't quite get why we weren't able to say, look, okay, I get it, he's electoral gold dust, but could we not compromise and find somebody who is a little bit more competent in the job? Maybe he's not going to win quite such a big majority, but is still going to win, right? I don't know who that person was, but it could have been Jeremy Hunt, could have been Sajid Javid, but did we really need to go down that route? And of course, I think the reason the Conservatives are not just lost this election is because of Boris Johnson. We sort of lay the seeds of our own destruction. That inevitable path to him blowing himself up in Partygate, the inevitable path of Liz Truss's catastrophe. Anybody who knew her could see that that was not a good choice, which then meant that Rishi Sunak from the beginning was seen as somebody by the party members who'd betrayed Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. So he was then, and he could never distance himself from them or reconcile with them. He was in the worst possible situation. He could neither say what I want to say, which is Boris Johnson was, in the end, not serious, and Liz Truss, in the end, bankrupted the economy, and therefore, this is what I would have tried to say as leader, I reject those people, we're going a completely different path, I'm rethinking the Conservative Party, and it's not their Conservative. He couldn't do that, because he was too worried about managing different parts of the faction. But equally, he didn't manage to reconcile with them either, so he's in the worst of worlds, where one group of people see him as a traitor who's betrayed Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, and another group of people see him as somebody who's appeasing them.
Was there a kind of palpable sense at the time of the contest that you were involved in that Johnson was effectively a kind of Faustian pact for the party? Were you aware that was a kind of a broadly held sense among backbenchers?
Yes. There was a very small number of people who genuinely believed in him. Nadine Dorris, for example, is a passionate believer in Boris Johnson. And I saw her last Thursday, and a friend of mine said to her, Nadine, you talk all the time about how you're against privilege and you're against old Etonians and, you hate David Cameron and Rishi Sunak. How come you're such a supporter of Boris Johnson? And she said, oh, he grew up in poverty like me. I said, well, see, the guy went to Eton. She went, no, he was a scholarship boy. It was real kind of poverty. And I was like, but his brothers went to Eton. She said, oh, they were also on scholarships, which incidentally, definitely one of them was not, right? Anyone who thinks, but he has somehow, with his immense charm, convinced Nadine Dorris, who genuinely grew up in poverty, she grew up in a very, very tough working class background, that he's like her. Well, he's not, right? Obviously, in any way. Kind of anyone can see that, except Nadine, right? So there were some people who really believed in him. But for the majority of MPs, all they thought, if I said to them, but sadly, he has a problem with the truth. He's lied to me, he's lied to you, he's lied to all of us. He lies to us all the time, right? And we may think it's charming, but he does, right? And it's very difficult to manage something if you're lying to people all the time. And he would say, well, it's not quite lie, I'm going to make everyone happy. So, I'll give an example of this. So when I was got the Africa strategy finally together, I presented it to him in a formal meeting with the permanent secretary and all the officials there. And he went, absolutely brilliant, Rory, 100%, 100%, let's do it. So I said, foreign secretary, is that it? Is this the signature, the approval? We now go with the strategy. Absolutely, no problem at all, off you go with the strategy. And I was like, okay, can I just run you through it once more? I'm saying we're going to have 400 more staff in Africa. We're opening this embassy. We're opening that embassy. You are approving all of this, okay, Boris? That's absolutely 100%, 100%. And he leaves the room, and I say to the permanent secretary, okay, we've done it. got the Africa strategy across the room. He went, well, Minister. And I said, well, what do you mean? The Foreign Secretary just signed off on the whole thing. And he said, yes. And I said, well, what's the problem? And he said, well, because if I go in tomorrow and say the opposite, he'll agree with me too. So we could all see that, right? And then the question is, do you get behind that person because you think that they can win? And it's not as extreme as Donald Trump, but it's a similar calculation that the Republicans are making with Trump. You know, why are they behind Trump? I just sat with one of the most senior members of the Republican Party, a congressman, chairs one of their most influential committees. And I said, what do you think about Donald Trump? And he went, well, Rory, I mean, it's not really relevant. You know, 85% of my voters love him. And I think that's disgraceful. I don't think you should be getting behind people who you think are no good at the job just because you can fool some people temporarily into voting for them, because in the long term, it destroys your brand. It's like, I don't know, it's like a bad business selling a cheap product that you don't believe in. It's going to go wrong for you.
In that leadership contest, I think you found yourself sort of squeezed in the middle because Remainers felt that you had sort of betrayed them by saying, I accept the democratic will of the people, and Brexiteers thought you betrayed them for not accepting a no deal.
Yeah.
In a sense, is that perhaps a kind of perfect sort of the embodiment of where you found yourself all the way through this process? Is that because you put so much emphasis on saying what you actually felt without compromise, it left you stuck in this position where you couldn't sort of please enough people to get where you wanted to be?
There's definitely part of that problem. And one of the problems is the shape of British politics changed. When I entered British politics, the opinion polls showed a bell jar, so the votes are where my fingers are in the centre. There are no votes where my elbows are. During the time when I was in politics, it collapsed in a kind of U shape. So then the votes are where my elbows are, they're not where my fingers are. And that's, sorry for people listening, not seeing, I've just gone from making a bell jar to a U shape with my fingers and elbows. And that meant that when I came out of the Brexit referendum, I thought, okay, people have voted for Brexit, so we need to leave the European Union. But it was a narrow margin, 52-48. We need to reunite the country, so let's have a compromise. Let's have a soft Brexit. Let's have a customs union. And it was really interesting. Very, very quickly, the customs union was labelled as the most evil thing imaginable. And yet I barely met anyone who knew what the customs union was. I mean, even my MP colleagues would be like, oh, we can't have a customs union. And I'd be like, what is a customs union? They're like, I don't know, but we can't have a customs union. And just about 2 hours before the vote on the customs union, I remember two senior ministers take me aside and say, can you just remind me what's the difference between the single market and the customs union? I ran tuition sessions because I began worried about MPs. 2 years into Brexit, they knew so little about the details of the European Union. I had to bring a guy in from the LSE, and I'd organised these meetings where we get 40 MPs around the table. Said, you know, this is off the record, ask any question you want. This is your opportunity to learn about the details of this. And some people, to give them credit, came. But it was 2 years in. And so, your question about, did I end up in the, of course, I ended up in the worst in all worlds.
Yeah.
Turned out that I thought, Britain's all about compromise. We've been about compromise. We're a very reasonable country. 80% of people are going to agree with me that, we don't want a hard Brexit. We don't want to remain. We want sort of a compromise in the middle. So it turned out 40% wanted a second referendum and 40% wanted nothing to do with Europe at all. And there was almost nobody left in the middle.
Mm. I mean, whatever one feels about Brexit and the processes that led to that point, and then what's happened since, it could be argued quite strongly that Brexit has been a long-term disaster for the Conservative Party. What do you feel the party needs to do now to rebuild in a kind of healthy, constructive way? What should be the priorities?
Well, the conversation, of course, is at the moment largely about the election results and votes. So I just got a message from a former very senior cabinet minister saying, come on, Rory, surely you don't believe the party should return to the centre now you've seen the result. You're not still banging on about that, are you? And what he's saying is that a lot of votes went to Reform. But the Conservatives lost 4 seats to Reform. They lost 60 seats to the Lib Dems. So this is not a simple story about all the losses on the right. They lost a lot in the centre and the left. And I honestly don't think in a first-past-the-post system there are enough votes on the sort of Farage right to be able to win an election. But there's a bigger point than the votes. The bigger point is your identity, your values. And the Conservative Party traditionally was seen as a serious party. And people might think they were a nasty party, but they were considered to be tough-minded, serious and professional. So let's take the reputation of Margaret Thatcher. A lot of people didn't like her, but people didn't think she was lacking in seriousness and conviction, right? The Conservative Party's best route back is to become a party that represents seriousness, carefulness, thoughtfulness, asking tough questions, making hard decisions, being grown-ups. And that's a long route back. And you're not going to become grown-up by getting behind Suella Braverman.
What's your impression of the new Labour government? Your initial sort of basic impressions of them?
Well, I think they're an interesting challenge to Conservatives like me because they're more conservative than you would have thought. I mean, it's going to annoy people hearing that. But the truth of the matter is that Keir Starmer is a serious former senior civil servant. His chancellor was a Bank of England official. They are people who have committed to not raising taxes, to cutting spending, to reducing the debt. It's a very, very cautious mandate and policies. I mean, the things that wound people up are significant, but they're not. They're on the margins. And I think, is serious about delivery. So in some ways, it's probably one of the most conservative Labour governments we've ever seen. One of the challenges, though, for them is going to be communication. One of the challenges, the top team is pretty dull. I mean, they need to loosen up and start being able to develop a sense of humour, be a bit more personal, be a bit more self-reflective, be a bit looser, be a bit bolder. Because this is an age, I'm afraid, for better or worse, of populist challenge. And you can't win by presenting yourself as only presenting yourself as a sort of sensible, cautious family solicitor. You can get 34% of the vote. You can get a majority if you're running against a completely discredited Conservative Party. But if they're going to win again, they're going to have to excite people.
Do you think they appear more technocratic than they actually are, or do you think they are technocratic?
I think Rachel Reeves is pretty technocratic. I think Keir Starmer is pretty technocratic. And they're very, 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 very cautious. Now, their defenders would say, maybe we could do with a bit of caution, a bit of boringness. But politics isn't just about administration. It's about inspiring people. It's about leadership. It's about vision. It's about communication. And if you're going to do really difficult things, you can't do them just by saying, I work hard and I'm competent. You have to make the case. You have to persuade people. And what we need to see out of Labour is, are they able to persuade people?
And just before we move on to subscriber questions, you're obviously in the flush and success of podcasting. Do you have any definite plans to return to public service, or do you think you may do at some point?
I definitely may do, and I would love to contribute to public service in some way. I'm not sure I want to try to become an elected MP again immediately. I mean, but if there was if Keir Starmer was setting up a cross-party commission on the NHS or something, I'd be very honoured to serve. I don't think he's going to invite me to do that, but that sort of thing I'd love to do.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask some questions submitted by our subscribers. Johanna asks, what is your biggest regret in your political career?
probably my biggest regret in my political career is not working out how to defeat Boris Johnson and steer the Conservative Party back onto a path that was more moderate and more thoughtful. And it is a regret because I can see, looking back, how many things I did wrong, how bad I was in the final leadership debate, how I didn't manage to communicate correctly on things like tax. I mean, there were a lot of tactical errors that I made. Now, I don't know whether I would have ever been able to defeat Boris Johnson, because looking back, he was in such an incredible lead going in. But I think there was a chance, if I'd made it through to the final two, I would have had 4 months to try to really make a case to the public. And so I do profoundly regret, particularly that second leadership debate, which I think did so much damage. I was very close to being able to creep into third and then second place there, and I blew it. Yeah.
You were under quite a lot of stress at the time of that last,
Yeah.
as you explained. So, I mean, I suppose you can't really regret being under the situation you were in, because it was quite difficult for you, wasn't it, I think?
Yeah, but you know, with time and with age and with context, I can see now that I made a lot of errors.
Robert asks, do you still consider yourself a conservative?
Yeah, I am a conservative. I'm a conservative of quite an old-fashioned sort. I'm a kind of conservative in the tradition that you would have recognized after the Second World War. I mean, I believe in being careful and prudent at home. I believe in being restrained abroad. I believe in love of country, tradition. I'm a passionate monarchist. I venerate the British Army. I love British history. I mean, these are things I don't share with most of the Labour front bench. I may agree with them on the fact that I think poverty in Britain's disgusting, homelessness is disgraceful, that we need to raise minimum standards for people in this country, and we need to look after the poor much better than we do. So I agree with Labour on that, but my values are very, very conservative. I'm a sort of romantic, old-fashioned, historical conservative.
I mean, I guess it's not just contrasting with the Labour front bench, but, you know, judging by the past 10, 15 years, lots of Conservative MPs would not really be classed as conservative in the sense that you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. So take Liz Truss, for example, who became Prime Minister. I deeply love the British countryside landscape and the history of the British countryside. She's not very interested in it. I love small farms in the Lake District and dry stone walls, and she has a kind of free market idea of giant mega farms producing efficiently. I revere the Foreign Office and British foreign policy, and she wants to abolish the Foreign Office. I have huge respect for the Treasury, and she wants to fire the Permanent Secretary of Treasury. I think the monarchy is one of the most precious institutions we have in Britain. She was a Republican. I'm Anglican. I'm a member of the Church of England. I go to church on a Sunday. I suspect she doesn't, right? So a lot of the edifices of my way of viewing Britain, which are a lot connected to fact. My father was 50 when I was born. He was born in 1922. He landed on D-Day. He was an officer in the Black Watch. He was a Foreign Office diplomat. I mean, my world was formed partly through the world of somebody of that generation, through which, of many Telegraph readers. And one of the odd things in my life is never quite understanding why people in the party who share my deep pride in those traditions in our history ended up getting behind people like Boris Johnson, who I promise you, Churchill would have been ashamed of, Macmillan would have been ashamed of, Margaret Thatcher would have been ashamed of.
Angela asks, what do you think of reform? And I think what she means by that is, what do you feel, how do you assess the risk, the dangers of reform to the Conservative Party? I think probably is
Yeah, so I think that you take it seriously. I mean, I think Farage is very good at pinpointing problems and talking about them in a very blunt, comprehensible way. A lot of the problems he identifies are true. I mean, it's one of the tricks of that kind of person that the problem is his solutions, right? I mean, he's talking about crazy unfunded promises, how he's going to fix it. I mean, this is the deal that we have to be careful about in democratic politics. It's not that difficult to say the emperor has no clothes. I mean, Farage gets congratulated from pointing out that the government says it's controlling immigration, actually 1.2 million people come in. He gets credit from pointing out that the government's not going to meet its net zero targets. It's true. And I can add to it. I can add to that. I can point out that civil service is broken, the NHS is broken, the government's running out of debt, that half the people have no idea what they're doing. The problem isn't that. Any of us can do that, right? We can sit in the pub, do that. That's why Farage is so popular. He's just resonating what we know, which is the whole thing is pretty shameful, pretty crocs, pretty broken. The question is, does anyone actually think this guy is going to be able to fix it? He's actually got the wherewithal to solve these things. Has he got the patience, the skill, the intellect, the time to work his way through that? And that's where the problem lies, right? That we're in a politics of kind of gesture, and this is wrong, that's wrong, right? But we're not really in a politics of how. How are you going to fix it? Not what's wrong, but how are you going to fix it?
Well, the message is a negative one rather than a positive one, isn't it, in that sense?
And it's not a message of hope either, actually, to be honest. I mean, it's yeah.
Well, on that note, Debbie says, what is the most positive thing you can say about the future? Which I think is a good way to end it.
Yeah, I think it's a lovely way to end. And I think we must, optimism is not naivety. Optimism is a moral quality. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that somebody who's so realistic and pessimistic that they just can see everything that's wrong and how everything's going to go wrong, gives up. Basically, you give up. You can tell a story, not just of Britain, but of the whole of the West, of its kind of decline. We're all getting poorer, the world's getting more violent, everything's getting out of control, democracies are collapsing. But if you start buying into that narrative, you become fatalistic and you just let it all collapse. We need hope. We need to genuinely believe that the things that we care about, looking after the poor properly, defending the rights and freedoms of British people, defending our democracy, defending our legal system and the rule of law, standing up for institutions that have done us very well, defending the security of Europe and the world, defending an international system, making the world a better place. These things are not naive. They're possible, they're achievable, and we should be voting for people who tell us how to do it.
Thank you for your time, Rory. If you weren't fast enough to get your hands on one of Rory's books, it's available at all good book retailers and, of course, Telegraph Bookshop, where you can save 20%. The next event will be a live recording of the Daily Tea with Camilla Tominey and Kamal Ahmed for their take on what Labour means for you, the Conservative Party and the country. It's on the 18th of July, so please check out the Telegraph Extra website to book free tickets. Good night.